Bonjour tout le monde. Comment
Good afternoon,
allez-vous?
everyone.
Mon nom
How
est
are
Julie
you?
Payette, je suis la
I'm
gouverneure
Julie
générale du
Payette.
Canada.
I'm Governor
Nous sommes
General
le
of Canada.
5 novembre
This is the
2020.
5th of November
Une journée
2020.
presque d'été qui se pointe dans l'est
It's
du
like
pays,
summer weather
mais nous
here
sommes
in Eastern
toujours en
Canada,
train de combattre ce virus
but we
qui
are
nous a
all
pris
still
d'assaut il y a
fighting
plus de 8 mois déjà.
the virus that has
Le
been with us for
COVID-19
over
est
8 months
encore fait
now.
des siennes et nous ne sommes
COVID-19
pas encore
is
complètement
still
sortis du
with
bois.
us, and
J'espère que
unfortunately, we're
vous
not out of the woods
respectez
yet.
les contraintes et
I hope
les
that you are
directives de la
following
santé
all of
publique
the
locale
guidelines
et que
issued
vous prenez bien
by
soin de vous.
Health
C'est très
Canada and your
important.
local authorities, and that you
Aujourd'hui,
are looking
nous
after
allons
yourselves.
avoir l'immense
This
honneur de
afternoon, we
parler
have the
avec
huge honor
une personne formidable que je
of
connais déjà
talking with
depuis
a
plusieurs
wonderful
années
person
et
whom
avec qui
I've
j'ai eu
known
la
for
chance de
many years
travailler.
and with whom I had
Mais
the
on va parler de
opportunity
quelque
to
chose
work.
qu'on a en commun parce
But
qu'on
we're
se
going to
connaît
talk about
depuis
something
plusieurs
we have
années
in
parce
common
que
because
mon
we
invité
have a lot
aujourd'hui,
in
Monsieur
common.
Charles
My
Tisser,
guest this
est
afternoon,
une
Mr. Charles
figure
Tisser,
incontournable de
is
l'industrie
someone
télévisuelle
who's
au
very
Québec, mais
well
je dirais
known
aussi au
in
Canada.
Quebec television
Il
industry,
est
but also
l'animateur de
throughout Canada.
Découverte depuis
He
maintenant
has been
plusieurs années, mais
hosting
auparavant, il était
Découverte for a
journaliste et
number
il
of
animait
years,
le téléjournal au
and
moment où j'ai
prior to
été
that, he
sélectionnée
was a
comme
journalist,
astronaute
and he was
en
a reporter
1992.
when
D'ailleurs,
I
cette
was
année-là,
selected as an
et on m'a
astronaut in
donné une anecdote
1992. In
ici
fact,
très intéressante.
that
Cette
particular
année-là,
year
c'était l'année où Roberta Bondar,
was the year
première Canadienne
Roberta
dans
Bonda,
l'espace,
the
a
first
effectué son vol spatial. Et
Canadian
M.
woman in
Tisser
space,
était à
did go
Cap
into
Canaveral,
space
au
then,
Kennedy Space
and
Center,
Mr. Tisser
pour
was in Cape
commenter
Canaveral
le décollage de la navette
to
Discovery
comment
avec
on
Roberta
the
Bondar à bord.
takeoff
Et
of
il y a eu des problèmes
the
techniques, paraît-il.
Discovery
Alors, il
shuttle
s'est
with
retrouvé avec
Roberta
Steve
Bondar
McLean, un
on
autre
board.
astronaute,
Steve
et
McLean,
ils ont
another
commencé une
astronaut,
discussion. Et M.
was there,
Tisser a
and they
impressionné
started
toute
a
la galerie
discussion.
avec ses
Mr.
connaissances et c'est
Tisser
encore le cas.
impressed
Si je peux
everyone
me
around
permettre,
him
M.
with
Tisser,
his extensive
vous avez
knowledge.
dit
Mr.
que vous
Tisser,
étiez
you said
à 5 kilomètres de la
that
navette.
you were just
Vous
5
avez vu les
kilometers away
flammes
from the
et
shuttle.
là, je vous
You
cite,
saw
tu n'entends rien
the
d'abord,
flames,
puis la
and
lumière
you
arrive plus
said
vite que le
you
son,
couldn't hear
qui
anything,
arrive 3 ou 4
and
secondes plus
there
tard.
were
Un
blasts
tonnerre
of light and
tonitruant,
sound.
le plus
It
fort que
was
tu n'as
just
jamais entendu.
unbelievable thunder.
Même
I
à 15
never
km
heard
lorsque
so
la
much
navette est sur le dos et qu'elle
thunder
continue à
and so much
monter,
noise.
tu sens la chaleur des
And
moteurs sur
you
ton
could
visage. C'est
feel the heat of the motors
lyricisme,
on your
il faut comprendre que
face,
M.
and
Tisser
it
a
was
déjà fait un bac en
unbelievable.
droit qui fait de lui
So
l'un
Mr.
des
Tisser is
animateurs et l'un des
familiar
journalistes les plus prisés
with
de notre télé. Il
what
est
really
aussi
happens
membre de
on
l'Ordre
the
du Canada
ground when
et
there
c'est
is
avec
a
grand plaisir
launch
que
of
je
a
l'invite
spacecraft. And it is a
maintenant à nous
huge
dire quelques mots.
pleasure
Bonjour, Monsieur
for me
Tisser.
to invite him here this afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Tisser. Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much, Madam Governor General. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you here to talk about all this and to remember all of those wonderful experiences. I would say that that was one of my best memories of my career. I remember Roberta Bondar, who was taking off, and I was there to cover that. It's something totally extraordinary to see a liftoff. I was told that at the launching time, I would just be totally taken away and I would be lifted off the ground. When I was told that, I was told as well that I would have to really grab onto something, otherwise I'd be thrown on the ground. I thought that was an exaggeration, but it wasn't. It is an incredible physical experience that really takes you away. You have experienced the takeoff of a shuttle twice, and you were inside it. So I remember that in 1992, when there was a liftoff, that it could be heard as far as New York, and you were actually in that shuttle later on. Well, in 1992, that was the year that I was chosen as astronaut. In fact, I think that was the first time that you interviewed me. That was when I was actually going through the selection process. But when Roberta Bondar went to space, the anecdote that was used at the time was very interesting, but I was actually doing the dishes at the time and I heard this anecdote about her, and that is when I was really taken. I was told that it was time to apply. And I remember hearing that Steve McLean had gone up in space. And I remember the very moment that we took off with other people around me, and everybody was holding their breath and their hearts were beating very, very fast. Now, when you're inside, it's unbelievable. We are so focused. We know what we're doing. We know where we're headed. So we're not quite as emotional. We're really on the job there. Well, yes, you have a very complex mission for which you studied for months, and you have to carry out that mission. So obviously, you have to focus on. Now, we have known each other for a long time. We worked um, together on Découverte, and Charles and I have known each other for years. That's why we're going to use our first names here. Now, this week, the week of November 2nd, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of a continuous human presence in space. Right now, there are three up there, one American and two Russians. Both of the Russians are called Sergei. I'm sure they have family names as well, but we have Sergei Rizhikov and Sergei Firzhikov. But pretty soon, there is going to be another commercial team that is going to arrive there on Dragon 9. And we're going to talk about that a little more later. But 20 years of continuous human presence up there on the space station. And so for the past 20 years, there have been humans up there. To give you an idea, it's about the size of a football field. Most of the modules are pressurized. There's 16 of them. They're in the middle, and that's where the crew live. And the rest is a structure that supports all sorts of equipment, and more specifically, 4 pairs of huge solar panels that generate power for the space station. It was supposed to be up there for about 15 years. That was supposed to be its lifespan, but it's already been there for 20 years now. In my view, and I don't know what you think of this, Charles, but this is something that we're going to remember throughout history, not just because of the construction and because of the science that's being carried out inside, but basically because it's the first time, it's 20 years ago, that it was decided, a number of nations had decided to put together all of their resources and work together to build a scientific lab in space. So to actually do all this engineering work in full cooperation, just for the sake of peace and scientific research. I think that's what everybody is going to remember. It's the first time that so many resources have been combined to further our knowledge. It really is quite amazing. Regardless of the countries or the nations, in fact, if you look at the Earth from space, you don't see any borders, you don't see separate states. If you can remember what Saint-Exupéry said, basically, we are all human beings. And when you think of what is going on up in space, that is the best example of planetary exploration with a view towards doing research in all sorts of areas, medicine and others. And this is just the starting point. Yes, indeed. The space station was always thought of as a collaboration platform, a scientific platform, but also a stepping stone that had to be used to enable us to stay in space even longer so that one day we'll be able to explore even further because we know that the space station is always orbiting Earth. It's never terribly far, 400,000 kilometers away from Earth. And is always possible for it to come back to Earth if there's a big problem. The problem with exploring outside of Earth's orbit, which we hope to see in the coming years, such as sending cosmonauts or astronauts to Mars, that's a different orbit, and there won't be any opportunity to come back to Earth quickly or easily. So it will be important to be able to have things on board to be able to cure people if they get sick, and those are all things that have to be taken into account. It won't be easy. What's amazing is that we have already carried out uh, dozens of missions, and some astronauts have stayed 6 months, others a year. If you think of 6 months, that's about the time that it would take for a flight to Mars. And so we have all of that experience as well, with the very important nuance that you said. That is that if you go to Mars, you can't come back to Earth very quickly. But we have stayed up where we are for a long time when you think of it. So we have already made huge progress towards our goal of reaching Mars. Now, the other challenge is that Mars has very little atmosphere, and to land there are more conventional ways of landing where you do it fairly slowly and open your parachutes. Well, we won't be able to do that. There are all sorts of technical aspects that will have to be ironed out. What do you think, though, of the arrival of commercial vehicles? Up until very recently, before the flight of capsule SpaceX, we always had space vehicles that were made by NASA or other governments. Or if you look at what's happening now, we have companies that are building those. Well, I think that project that was launched really by Barack Obama will do what you've just described. Well, it kind of frees up the Canadian Space Agency and NASA to have them focus on research. But for most Canadians, it might mean easier access to the terrestrial orbit. Maybe it will be possible to spend a few days or even weeks on the space station. But if you're talking about adding different modules, maybe they could have hotels, perhaps a hotel in orbit, and then people would be able to see the Earth from up there. That would be a real life experience. We do know that there's some people who have an awful lot of money, and it's something that could become commercially viable. You never know. So there are these two facets to it. There's the commercial aspect, and then there's the research aspect. What is wonderful is that it will give an opportunity to a greater number of human beings to experience what you did, which is to be in space. Well, if it were just to allow people to see how unique our planet is and that it belongs to all of us, you said that when you see it from up in space, you don't see the borders. And we all know that viruses don't know any borders either. Neither do hurricanes or earthquakes. This planet is very much alive, but it's the only one that we have right now. It's the only planet where humans can live right now. And when you see it from such a huge distance in this little capsule, you realize that it's very important to protect it. And I think it would be good if more people had the opportunity to see the Earth from that perspective. It really would be an incredible experience for people. Would you go? Well, now that my children are grown up, if I had the opportunity to do so, yes, I would, especially with the vessels that have been built so far, they're quite safe. Even the one that you were on, well, they were certainly a huge technological feat, and they were fairly safe for sure. But now the shuttles are even safer than that. And yes, I would certainly go up there if I could. Yes, I certainly would do it again as well, and probably with my son. But we'll wait until the prices drop a bit. Shall? This is live, and people can certainly watch this conversation on YouTube and Facebook and other networks. People can also send in questions, and here I have one. It's from Mrs. Jasmine Desrochers, who's watching us on Facebook. Here's the question. What is the interest in going to Mars? What do people expect to discover there? Answer? Well, we would certainly like to see if there are any signs of life. There are some things that have already been discovered, like bacteria that can support incredible temperatures. We've noted different toxins that can also survive. And we think that maybe on Mars, we could discover some form of life. That would be extraordinary. Right now, the only thing that we can rely on are things that exist on our planet. And when you think of developing a civilization, well, that's one thing. But if you look at something like bacteria, well, that's a very fascinating phenomenon. But we have to remember that the destiny of humans is the stars. We have been made to explore space. Now, we used to have the Cold War, but and we have to add to that that the important thing is to not destroy anything. Well, we have to remember that our future is in the stars. So it's all of those factors combined. We can't stop ourselves from doing that. We are going to do that, and we're going to progress. We are going to go to Mars one day and other planets as well. I think that is unavoidable. I fully agree with you. There is this desire to explore, to go where man has never been, to climb huge mountains, to push the boundaries of human knowledge. All this exploration. You are the host of a show called Découverte. It's impossible for humans to resist the urge to go and discover things. We have already been to the moon, but that was 50 years ago now. And we've never been to another planet. It's obvious that one day we will do so. But here's the question, and this is the one that interests the most. Will there be any proof that there was life on Mars? And that would prove that we are not the only ones in the universe to actually have human life. I often quote Arthur C. Clarke, who says that there are just two possibilities. There's either just one form of life in the world, and that's us, or there are two forms of life, and both of those options are terrifying. It's a fundamental question. And there's also the question of the ability to actually go to another planet. Steve Hawkins, towards the end of his life, had taken a number of initiatives, and he said quite often that we needed Mars in case there were some very stupid things that would happen here on Earth. And I hope that we will always take care of our planet Earth, that we will make the right decisions, we will have the right technologies that will allow us to stay on this planet for many, many, many years. Answer. Carl Sagan said that everything that has existed in our history, love stories, wars, whatever, can be summarized in the one little thing that you can see in space, and that is one of the things that really allows us to believe that we are very precious and ecosystems absolutely have to continue to survive. It's very exciting to be in space, but astronauts are always very anxious to get back to Earth. After all, on Earth we have our families, our friends, and all of our activities, and nothing can replace that. It's wonderful. And that's why right now, during this pandemic, where we're confined and we have to restrict our movements, it's very difficult for everyone. The second wave, I know that you have done a lot of reports on this. I know that on Découverte, you have explained to people exactly what is going on, how the virus is spread. Do you see the light at the end of the tunnel, even if we're still experiencing a second wave? Answer. Yes, because we're very close to having an effective vaccine. There are a lot of big pharmaceutical companies that are going to show us the results of their trials very soon. And we hope that the results will be validated. And we hope indeed that the vaccine will be distributed to the most vulnerable people, such as seniors first. And we really want the public at large to be vaccinated. I recently listened to a microbiologist who was saying on the radio, in answer to a question, what is the solution? We seem to be going round in circles. And the answer that she gave was the vaccine. And I think the vaccine will be here soon. That's something I'm very hopeful for. There's also medication that allows us to develop antibodies that are very effective at fighting the virus. We saw that recently, and there will be more talk of this in the coming weeks. Those are solutions that are coming down the pipe, and I would say pretty soon things are going to change for the better. Question? Well, you talked about the clinical trials that are going on right now to treat the disease. That information will help us a lot to treat other illnesses as well, other diseases, especially respiratory illnesses. So even in this climate of adversity, this health crisis that has affected so many people, people have even they've lost loved ones, they've lost their jobs. And despite all this, I think there might be some good that comes of it. There will be a little bit more conciliation, cooperation. When people wear their mask and keep their distance, it means that they are being good corporate citizens. I was really impressed with how people agreed to do all those little things out of respect for their fellow citizens. I have a question here that was sent in. I really like this question, and I'm going to ask you, Charles. What was Canada's contribution to the International Space Station, and how is it essential? Answer. Well, they couldn't have built it without us. Uh, there was the Canadarm2, for example, that is there. There's also the robot that can kind of go out and walk around. Really, we had a great deal of technology to contribute, and without us, they couldn't have built it. Also, a lot of research was done. Biomedical research was carried out to better understand diseases such as osteoporosis, anything relating to aging or the cardiovascular system, because certain physiological changes occur much faster in space than on Earth. And so our studies have enabled us to carry out research on the astronauts once they came back to Earth, and that has been very helpful. If you look at our nervous system, look at our vision and the way our brain works, our research continues here on Earth. And if you look at what has happened to the astronauts when they were in space and look at their blood samples when they came back to Earth, that is huge information. Canadians were able to contribute a lot to the space station, but also when the astronauts come back, they can contribute a lot as well. Question? Well, since people who are on the space station can't go see a doctor any day of the week, well, we have to remember that there were 3 Canadian astronauts. There was David Saint-Jacques, Chris Hadfield, and others, and they were part of this huge international adventure. But I don't know if you know this. Once you come back to Earth, once we've finished our career as astronaut, we continue to participate in long-term studies for space agencies, especially for medical research. In fact, just recently, I went for my physical again because people want to know what happens to people who have spent time in space. We get more exposure to radiation when we're up there, and we develop different ways of doing things. And the researchers want to know what kind of disease we may be prone to, in fact, what we're going to die of ultimately. And so every year I have to go for my physical so that all of this information can be used for further research. Answer? Well, yes, you were there twice, and so you spent a lot of time in space. It's quite remarkable that you are still being followed. You're still part of the experiment when you think of it, Judy. Answer, yes, it is. It is a great honor. Question. Now, speaking of data, we have spoken to a number of researchers, and a number have said that research is now at the forefront with this pandemic. We know that there will be a solution. There will be treatment, a cure, vaccines, but we have also heard all sorts of things about COVID. And not all of the information was true or verifiable. One of your tasks is to inform people through your show Découverte, but also through other means. To what extent is it important to inform people properly today, given all of the misinformation? Answer, yes, there is all sorts of false information. If you look at the web, there's all sorts of erroneous scientific data. If you look at public broadcasters such as Radio-Canada or others, our job as journalists is to look at what is going on, and we have to look at the scientific results, and we have to be very careful. We have to be very rigorous. At the outset, we didn't know much about this virus, and over time, science enabled us to know that illness better. Now, 8 months into it, we know more about it and we know what kind of intervention is required. That information has to be communicated properly to our listeners because everybody is affected by this. The role of the scientific journalist is to look at the facts and to follow the science very, very closely. If people know that, they'll follow some shows because they will know then that science is advancing on certain topics such as COVID. Question? Well, I understand that you double check all of the information that you are given so that people can rely on the information that you give. And that is the role of all journalists and anybody who works in the media, they have to really check the facts. We have to rely on people like you to guide us and help us better understand. It is important to continue to ask questions and analyze things, not just take everything that we are told as a given. It's important to check all of the information, especially nowadays because we hear incredible things. And here is another question that I have received. We were here to mark the 20th anniversary of the human presence of 20th anniversary of humans in space. I was wondering what's going to happen when it is no longer possible to have people up there. Because the question is, what is going to happen the day that the International Space Station is no longer operable? Answer, that is a real problem. Remember the Mir station when the Russians had to put an end to its life? It came back into our atmosphere and there were all sorts of pieces that broke off and fell into the ocean. Yes, that was a number of years ago. Yes, there were a number of pieces that weighed, a few tons that fell down. But the International Space Station is much bigger than Mir. So what is going to happen? Are they going to break it into different pieces and bring it back in a controlled manner? Maybe we'll have to attach it to a rocket and take it somewhere else much further so that it can never actually fall back down on our planet. But it is a big problem. Why not put a rocket up there and tie it to the rocket and then take it to Mars or something? Question? Well, that is very interesting because that might give an opportunity to a company to develop the technology to look after the space station, but also to take care of the space waste, if you will, all of these pieces that might fall off and fall back to Earth. I do think that one day that industry is going to develop to go and pick up the old satellites, if you will. Charles, our time is already up, and so I'm terribly sorry, but I just have time to thank you and your team for all of the work that you do at Découverte. I'd like to thank you for your dedication to your amazing profession, and once again, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I hope that we will have an opportunity to talk again once we finally do have this vaccine. And maybe you could tell us about how we managed to produce that vaccine. Answer? Thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of the colleagues as well who have worked on this file. And thank you very much for being there with us for so many years. Thank you for inviting me, and keep up the good work. And for all of you who have listened, thank you very much for participating. If you're interested in this, the first long-term crew is going to take off on the 14th of November. You will be able to see that. It's the Dragon capsule. There will be 4 astronauts, 3 Americans and 1 Japanese astronaut. So for next week, for our conversations, it will be Remembrance Day. On November 11th, we're going to commemorate the men and women in uniform. And we must remember that this year is the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, that horrible conflict that cost us so many lives. We will never forget them. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye-bye.